Welcome to Live Players, where political scientists and strategists Samo, Buja, and I discuss the key individuals with the power to alter our current society. Every week, we provide analysis of the news and case studies of live players as well as key institutions and technologies that make up the global power landscape. Let's dive in. Hello, sir.
Hey, Erik.
Hey, great to see you.
Good to see you. What do you feel is like the most undersupplied that will like be most interesting to the audience? A lot of people talking about the meta thing, and we can definitely talk about it. Or we could talk about AI. What if we had a title of something like why AI needs hardware? Or why hardware is the way to win the AI race?
Yeah, I love that. So why don't we start there? Why don't you sort of elaborate on the case for why hardware is needed to win AI?
The overall thesis I'd have is that one of the most interesting aspects of our industrial civilization has been that after the invention of the computer, essentially, the more capital you have around, the more data you gather, right? There's like everything in terms of sort of intermediating human communication, where instead of me talking to you directly, we're talking over a Zoom call or we're tweeting at each other on x.com. That represents one data set. Another data set is obviously now been well used, which is that everyone has a cheap camera that they carry around in their pocket. So humans have been busily documenting the physical world or the appearance of the physical world for our databases for the last 10 years. And in many ways that drove social media. And now when we're looking at companies such as Waymo or the Tesla robotaxi, we're also seeing that when you roll out a self-driving car, you're kind of rolling out a sensor platform, right? You're actually gathering this physical data of what it is like to navigate and move through the world, but also what is probably the most complete digital depiction of the realities of traffic in major American cities that has ever been made. All of these very ambitious attempts were something that predated AI, right? And one has to give credit to Google, where in past years with initiatives like Google Maps, the original self-driving project where they, mapped out the city, even their old book digitalization efforts, these were all done in the 2000s and the 2010s, long before, say, ChatGPT and AI made the value of data apparent. So that is that side of hardware. The other side of hardware, which is also equally frequently discussed, is then essentially computation, right? The computational substrate where these large training runs and where the inference also is happening. People now understand the importance and value of these large data centers, but they don't understand how important two aspects of the compute are. First, it really does matter, not just in a big strategic way, but in a very practical, who gets to have favorite customer status way, where the chips are made. Now, of course, China will sell us GPUs if they were to leapfrog or beat TSMC and Taiwan, and of course also by extension, the American fabless GPU producers like NVIDIA. If they were to leapfrog us, they would sell us these. And, there would be, of course, like still, the question of national security, but let's limit ourselves to purely economic competitiveness. Chinese companies are going to have a closer relationship to Chinese chip fabs. It's that simple. One of the most neglected reasons why NVIDIA is semi-untouchable is because that the founder of NVIDIA, Taiwanese American. Jensen is Taiwanese American, and the founder of TSMC just personally liked him and kind of wanted to work with Taiwan. Let's be kind of direct here as well. The national interest of Taiwan has already impacted US national policy. No one has yet coined the term the Taiwan lobby, but I'm coining it right now. The Taiwan lobby goes through the very foundations, the hardware foundations of Silicon Valley. And in fact, we have already heard this, there is a nuance there, of course, but the Taiwan lobby is the sort of like let us maintain the status quo and independence of Taiwan, but let's not ban Taiwan from selling to China, right? Because Taiwan's political interests lie with the United States. Taiwan's economic interests lie with the mainland. Because no matter how much we buy from Taiwan or how much American corporations, such as Nvidia and so on, partner up with TSMC, the truth is that they outsource something like half of their manufacturing facilities to the mainland. Like they might not even be competitive with South Korea without the Chinese mainland. And that's something worth considering because, say, South Korea with Samsung could potentially have entered this market. And of course, years ago, Japan basically was outcompeted by Taiwan. Taiwan finds itself perpetually vulnerable to being outcompeted by any other country that has this possible technological transfer that historically came from the United States, but also, again, from Japan, which is this forgotten semiconductor giant. And the only real remnant of this is Tokyo Electron, this large company that was almost like almost a wrap up or a conglomerate of the remainder of Japan's semiconductor industry. So one end there, but the other end is also, I think people actually have to know the hardware very, very well to optimize it. So I think what DeepSeek has demonstrated is that you can squeeze out quite a bit more efficiency through 1,000 minor optimizations and hacks out of even what are not top of the shelf high-end chips. In fact, there's a lot of sludge between the physical silicon and the AI processes being trained. There's like a lot of spare compute, there's a lot of spare capacity. And that kind of close to hardware optimization, well, everyone talks about CUDA, but CUDA has to be sort of a little bit rewritten every single time NVIDIA designs like truly new silicon. So that's kind of interesting in its own regard. Potentially AMD, if they hired truly world-class software engineers, such as, I don't know, maybe Hotz, right? George Hotz would be a good example. Or if they bother to go find and acqui-hire a Carmack if he was still available or someone like that, I think AMD could actually properly compete with NVIDIA. But the flip side of this is also true in China, and China has excellent software engineers, and these software engineers can talk to and live in the same city where the chips are being built. If anyone doubts that that's important, sure, because the US Taiwanese partnership is so close, that the American GPU companies and the big AI research labs have significant access to some TSMC resources. They have significant access, of course, to the design that NVIDIA produces. They can talk to all of these people. Yet still, I think that if this was all co-located, so in other words, if Silicon Valley truly still was Silicon Valley, I don't know. I think we would squeeze about 30 to 40% more compute out of those giant $500 billion data centers, a la what Stargate is supposed to be, and some of the other ones that people are talking about building.
I want to get your thoughts on export controls or some of the trade-offs there as we think about sort of AI policy vis-a-vis China. What do you think are the various sort of pros and cons of the regulatory options, and how should we think about it?
I think the export controls came too late, and they have actually incentivized and jump-started the prioritization of China wanting to develop the full semiconductor stack. I think they would have gone for it eventually anyway. I think it's overdetermined. It's sort of like, why is China building its own jumbo jets? Why don't they buy them from Airbus or from Boeing? I mean, from Boeing, we could maybe joke that they're dropping out of the sky still. But the real reason is that China just has a list of these high-end industries that are supposed to be higher value add that they were pursuing before at all being convinced that AI and GPUs specifically are going to be this very strategically important thing, this thing that the US will bet the farm on, right? We could joke that the US has bet the farm on AI working out. What is the farm? Maybe the farm is the literal farmland of the United States. There's lots of examples of, say, Gates and large companies like Google buying literal farmland just because it's so hard to put large amounts of money anywhere. But joking aside with that, I don't know, people used to call Russia a gas station with nukes. I don't know, it feels to me lately like the US is a data center with nukes. And, the data center's components are all built in China. And I think you can't really solve this by telling basically a design office that, hey, you have to give nerfed designs to China. Why? Because this office knows full well, NVIDIA knows full well, as does AMD, that they are in fact competing with very competent people, some of who are former TSMC or NVIDIA employees, right? Truly, that is a significant block, a significant constraint on what you can do as a company. And you can comply with these export restrictions, but make it very easy for people to hack or unlock the locked potential from your top of the shelf, top of the line cards. So you can sell like the nerfed version and then be like, and oh, by the way, don't twist this screw, because if you twist this screw, you're going to get 30% more performance out of your GPU. I think it's just very hard to legislate against workarounds like that. So where does that leave us? Does that mean that we just have to comply with what is most efficient in some sort of externality-free Econ 201 thought experiment? No. But it does mean that the US would have to designate a special industrial zone, ideally a special industrial zone very close physically to where the big AI data labs are. So honestly, it has to be the Bay Area. It has to be near San Francisco. Subsidize it with very cheap energy, remove the relevant regulations, and perhaps even have government funds go into it. Look, we're talking about a world where we're already adding $5 trillion to the budget or to national debt like it's nothing, right? We should be investing about $500 billion or $1 trillion as a one-time thing to build out the ecosystem there, provided with cheap energy. And I think we could beat China, because it's a lie that China has cheap labor. China has not had cheap labor in a while. And it especially does not have cheap labor in these very competitive industries, where at the end of the day, here's another one. The CCP is not interested in suppressing wages. They consider wage growth to be one of the delivered promises of the party to the Chinese. It's like they talk about the Chinese dream. So from their perspective, if there are 5 big Chinese technology firms and they're building useful stuff like, self-driving cars, like something like Apollo or whatever, building planes, building EVs, because every Chinese company now wants to build EVs if it's building electronics, they don't mind if they bid up the price of these engineers up to 100K a year, 200K a year. They would see that as a great success of their system. So having said all of this, coastal labor in China is no longer cheap. It is just very skilled. And I think in the US, there is a case to be made for a very limited pull of basically trying to steal Taiwan's talent. However, I'm not sure how Taiwan would feel about that. I think they would want, something in return, but they couldn't really stop us. Then the tricky question, though, is how do you make that happen, right? How do you make this behemoth of the US federal government do that? And that's harder. And look, if you can't do that in the Bay Area, if you cannot have a national priority override local city politics and override state politics, then you have to go for the second best option. And in the US, at least, the second best option I see is somewhere in Texas that has easy access to basically like ocean shipping, because, all else equal, the shipping costs do matter as well. So I don't know, perhaps next to Starbase Texas, you build, I don't know, you build something like, I don't know, Silicon Flats or something. I don't know what to call it. GPUville. And, you just manufacture it there. And that's where the investment goes. And maybe the state of Texas is already relatively hands off. They wouldn't mind extra federal spending, and they have the economies of scale to truly grow it to something that could compete to Shenzhen.
Hey everybody, Erik here with a word from our sponsors. It's an interesting time for business. Tariff and trade policies are dynamic, supply chains squeezed, and cash flow tighter than ever. If your business can't adapt in real time, you're in a world of hurt. You need total visibility, from global shipments to tariff impacts to real-time cash flow. That's Netsuite by Oracle, your AI-powered business management suite, trusted by over 42,000 businesses. Netsuite is the #1 cloud ERP for many reasons. It brings accounting, financial management, inventory, HR into one suite. With one unified business management suite, there's one source of truth, giving you the visibility and control you need to make quick decisions. With real-time forecasting, you're peering into the future with actionable data. And with AI embedded throughout, you can automate a lot of those everyday tasks, letting your team stay strategic. NetSuite helps you know what's stuck, what it's costing you, and how to pivot fast. If I had needed this product, it's what I'd use. It's one system, full control. Tame the chaos with NetSuite. If your revenues are at least in the 7 figures, download the free ebook, Navigating Global Trade, Free Insights for Leaders, at netsuite.com/102. That's netsuite.com/102.
Let's say you controlled all AI policy in the US as regards to what we should do for our own national interest, but also how we should sort of contain China or just think about other players. What else would you do, or say more about how you think about it?
I think that, Europe's not a serious competitor. We're lucky in that regard. I think some tariffs on exports, it's not a bad idea, but it has to be paired up with a tighter industrial policy, which means that I would be directing a Sputnik moment like national tracking to identify, develop, train top talent to basically work in semiconductors, and then just develop this very high-end capability to build those. And I would eventually start going down the chain. I mean, ideally, you first start at the bottom and you work your way up, sort of an industrial dependency stack. But we don't really have that option. But the US has a wide extended empire. These companies like ASML and Tokyo Electron, if the US targets those companies for replacement with a US company, all located in the same concentrated area, I think the US could succeed. Now, yes, of course, a company like ASML relies on a deep ecosystem of various optics manufacturing and so on in Germany, in the Netherlands. So what? We can steal that too. So we should just have a simple roadmap of, our weaker allies are just going to have to take the hit. And we are just going to ship these industries over one by one. And we're going to have a limited number of visas, but these will be paired up with a nationwide effort to identify top young talent and track them to this new opportunity zone as fast as possible. So this is a state-intense approach. This is an industrial policy-based approach. And I would emphasize here knowledge transfer and talent acquisition as two separate things, right? You can have knowledge transfer by just doing like a binational partnership or an international partnership. But I think that we just have to identify talent within the United States. Of course, the world's talent still matters, et cetera, et cetera. But I think one thing that people miss is that a big reason that China can catch up so easily to the United States is that a lot of the talent is always just tempted to go back home to China. Like, even if we give them a green card, they might go back home to China. And especially towards the end of their life, a lot of the top academics do. And I wouldn't prevent that. I'm just saying there is actually no replacement for having a component of American talent working directly on these projects. Because then, ideally you want patriotism and the profit motive pointing in the same direction, right? Whenever you try to make them cross purposes, sometimes one wins over the other. And I think we want both pillars pointing towards, hey, I actually want to stay in Texas, or I want to stay in New Silicon Valley we put it on Alameda Island or some other abandoned US naval base nearby to the Bay Area. And, I think that sounds ambitious, but wait, that's just the kind of stuff that South Korea does routinely, and the kind of stuff Taiwan did, and the kind of stuff that Japan did, and the kind of stuff Germany did before it decided to commit economic suicide. And we have all of this leverage to force a technology transfer just through access to US markets, right? Like we did successfully force TSMC to work with the US, to work with Intel. It was just a very stupid idea to have it partner with Intel rather than open the field. Can you imagine if instead of a SpaceX, you had a ChipX or something, like a new startup that got a small government contract to work with TSMC and then build their very first chip fab? That would be so much more radically efficient a way to cultivate American institutional capacity than it is to pivot this 20th century dinosaur that is Intel and try to have them develop something that has not been a core competence of theirs for a long time because they were so radically outcompeted.
Could there be a TSMC in the US, or like a company that can sort of get to that stature and significance in that space?
I think the US should. Maybe it has to go through defense. Maybe the argument, in the US at least, industrial policy is often done by the Pentagon. And of course, the best national security resource for the United States is its world-class economy. And I think some people at, say, DARPA always understood this. But, I think if we had something like, we have a need for purely US manufactured chips for the purposes of our most sensitive data centers, right? You start the argument with something like the NSA and the CIA, right? No one would disagree with the idea that, hey, those chips that the NSA is using to run AI processes that trawl all of this giant piles of data that the NSA also collects that is supposed to be keeping us safe. No one objects to the idea that these chips should be fully US made, and that even our closest allies, even Taiwan or Britain or Germany, or honestly Israel for that matter, do not deserve a backdoor into those. Pretty straightforward, right? It's pretty straightforward national security argument. And then how much is that worth? Is that worth 100 billion? Is that worth $1 trillion? I don't know. I think we could push in 400 to 500 billion and it would be worth that sort of deficit. Now that's not quite enough, but if you give small scale demonstrations for some niche uses of chips that are not cutting edge chips, you put these contracts out, you let new startups bid on those contracts. Maybe if you have to make the political economy work, to make the bribes work, you're like, okay, we're going to build it redundantly and we're going to give the same amount of money to Intel and this new startup, whichever startup gets there first. But even if you do it that way, I think this is deficit spending that will repay itself with a wealth of knowledge being brought to the United States and a wealth of talent being developed. How many people around the world would find it inspiring not just to move to the US, but hey, if you want to work on America's TSMC, this startup led by this brilliant young guy or woman will be America's TSMC. And its minimum market size is providing all of the chips of the NSA. Okay, that sounds pretty good, actually. So there's actually a third statement here. It's like you want patriotism, the profit motive, and the drive for glory to all point in the same direction. And that direction should be America's TSMC. Again, Texas is also beautiful for a variety of reasons, as is California. They have the potential for true energy abundance. So then you might have this beautiful situation where you co-locate data centers next to the chip fabs, next to the AI labs, and people are, I don't know, a 20 or 30-minute drive away from visiting the place where the chips are made, or people who are making the chips can visit the place where the chips are deployed. What is the cumulative advantage of 10 years even of 15-minute drives rather than 15-hour flights? Oh, I think that's actually hard to beat. And you know what? Last I checked, Taiwan does not have a giant national security apparatus and does not have the world's largest consumer economy. So wait, they actually needed us as much as we need them. So I actually think that's a crushing advantage. If only you assume that further and much faster hardware and technological progress is possible. Now, if it's a mature technology, if actually, chips are like just so hard, then energy costs and labor costs dominate. But if there's rapid technology progress possible, then I don't know, the difference between two developed countries such as Taiwan and the US in labor costs should be trivial, especially if you can pay the new ambitious top talent coming in from both within the United States and internationally. If you can pay them with equity in the new TSMC, just give them 1%, give them 0.5%, give them like truly astounding, like eye-watering possibilities of compensation. Since you're paying them with future coin, that works. Can you imagine how difficult it would be to give someone like 0.5% of, or 0.25% of TSMC stock? Like that would be, it's kind of administratively impossible except in the most ambitious deals. I'm positing that there's so much left to do in hardware that betting heavy on knowledge and fast iteration just completely swamps considerations like labor cost. And honestly, in terms of energy, the US is about as good as it gets in a major country. Like, sure, China has a little bit lower energy. Maybe this shows up in the cost of manufacturing them. It definitely shows up in the cost of running the data centers. But hey, the data centers are already run in the United States. Last I checked, they're not being run in Taiwan. Making that physical feedback loop between the people designing the chips, people making the chips, people using the chips, that flywheel would be a crushing US advantage that no country in the world could match. It would need a few years to get started. It would need an ambitious founder, and it would need a government contract of a significant size to bet on a small and unproven company. But hey, that's what the Falcon 1 was, right? That was the origin of SpaceX was the defense state betting on these small satellite launches. And then now the US is undisputedly globally dominant in rockets. Let me propose that rockets were, when Elon started his company, a far more mature technology than AI specialized chips are. We've barely begun to make AI specialized chips. So let's remember, these are descended from gaming rigs. Just 10 years ago, the gaming market was, I think, like totally comparable in its demand for GPUs as all of the AI stuff was.
I want to go deeper and better understand kind of your mental model for automation. I mean, on the one hand, we were talking about how it's kind of a overrated concept, the idea that China has low wage or cheap labor. We also hear on one end, some people are saying, oh, AI is going to automate a lot of entry level jobs, kind of low wage, sort of email jobs. And on the other hand, people say, no, it's actually going to automate a lot of sort of the consultant class or a lot of the, high-end knowledge work as well. What's your mental model for thinking about automation in general and where the difference is from how it's commonly conceived?
I think it was a little bit downstream of the ease of data collection, right? If you think about it, everything on your computer or your phone is already recorded. So all economic activity that happens inside the laptop, you can train on it. That is sort of the advantage of the physical world, the unskilled laborer, right? And Baumol's cost disease, which is this phenomena where as a society becomes richer, basic services become more expensive through there's a variety of causes, but let's say one of the most basic ones is that just the cost of labor keeps going up. If I want to hire 50 guys to build an intricate stone wall on my ranch, that is certainly going to be much more expensive now, even adjusting for inflation, than it would have been 100 years ago, and certainly more expensive in the United States than it is in in Serbia or it is in Mexico, let alone a place like India. In a way, it's driven by a kind of labor scarcity, right? So unskilled labor, assuming you have something else that the unskilled labor could be doing, right? You're competing in a way, delivering someone's Uber Eats order is competing with maybe them working in a restaurant, and them working in a restaurant is competing with them managing a restaurant, and them managing a restaurant is competing with, them being a nurse, or maybe being a nurse is competing with them being an accountant, et cetera, all the way to software engineers, right? And sometimes pretty directly, it's sort of like, oh, should I be an intern for free and then earn 200K in 2 years, or should I get a real job and become self-sustaining first and not get that free internship and be in a different sector of the economy rather than big tech, et cetera, right? There's or the startup world, let's say, that would be more realistic than, I think, the Google internships are like so parceled out at this point that it's hilariously careerist. The automation impact, Jevons paradox is sort of true, and it's often brought up, which is that, often if you make something much cheaper, you actually increase demand for it significantly. So I think automating part of a task actually makes the average worker more productive. And if it drops costs, it increases demands and can actually, again, increase the compensation and even the total labor demand for that position. There's an inelasticity of human talent that's not frequently discussed, but I think we have to talk about here. It's not quite a bell curve. It's not quite IQ. What good is an IQ of 120 if you have crippling attention deficit disorder, right? One can still find good economic niches, but it's a bit more limited. Perhaps it's better to be, have an IQ score, an intelligence quotient score of 110, and have like a very diligent, strong work ethic, or an IQ of 115, have like, better social skills, etc. But having said all of that, I do think that there's an inequality of the distribution of economically valuable talent in the population. And that's just one of the things that economists, I don't think they like discussing it. I don't think they like it at all. That's why the sort of like, in 2007, the happy neoliberal story of what to do with the coal miners is to have the coal miners learn how to code. Today, I don't think we can even tell them to learn how to code. I don't think it's credible, given layoffs in some of the big tech aspects. Now it's sort of like become an AI scientist. And that already sounds so ridiculous, right? That no one even says that. No one says, hey, AI is actually super easy to learn. If you're like smart and dedicated, it takes 2 to 3 years to get to the cutting edge. If they say that at a university classroom at the math department. There, maybe they say, hey, actually, the AI theory stuff is not that deep. No one's telling that to coal miners. No one's telling that to Uber Eats delivery people. No one is telling that to the Lyft drivers. And, no one's really telling it to the maids, the nurses, the firemen, the police officers, et cetera, et cetera. But what are those last three professions that I mentioned? Firemen, nurses, policemen. Okay, police officers, I guess. All of these are actually professions that have a substantial component of government-induced demand. So I think the default future with the automation of white-collar work is disruption of white-collar workers in the private sector with a winner-takes-all dynamic. And then, ironically, and somewhat perversely, an empowerment of the white-collar professionals in government or para-government or pseudo-government environments. I sort of tweeted a while ago that, you can't automate fake jobs. The reason is that if you free up someone from having 20 hours a week on the clock to lobby for the existence of their bureaucratic position and have 20 hours of real work. You automate 50% of their real work. They now have 30 hours to lobby for the existence of their position. And if you automate all of their work, well, then all 40 hours of their office time can be spent on arguing and coming up with reasons for why their department should be bigger. So in other words, when you almost fully automate a job, you're actually in a way making the principal agent problem worse, right? You're making it harder to get these workers to actually pursue the mission of the bureaucracy rather than their own immediate career and professional interests, or even at the end of the day, their political opinions. So, okay, that's what happens with the white collar class. Entry into the white collar class becomes limited, actually. So social mobility goes down when you speed up automation. So if you automate large sectors of white collar work, the number of people who are going to go from blue collar to white collar, it's going to shrink. The class will be defensive. It'll be competitive, right? They will come up with barriers to entry and they will lobby for the existence of barriers to entry. In a world where, paper pushers are in high demand, existing paper pushers do not mind hiring blue collar workers to become junior paper pushers because that grows your empire, because you expect your department to be larger next year, not smaller. So it's a pyramid scheme in a way. And you're actually open to welcoming new people to your class. If you expect your paper pushing department to be smaller or the same size next year as it is this year, you will throw up barriers to entry and you will lobby and argue for barriers to entry. So we'll see a tapering off of people moving from blue collar or unskilled work into white collar professions if white collar professions get automated. Downward mobility, extremely dangerous. Politically speaking, there's nothing quite as dangerous as a frustrated bureaucrat. Hitler got rejected from art school and Vladimir Lenin failed the civil service exam several times. And then, they just made their own way after and, ended up in government service anyway. So what inspirational stories if I'm being sarcastic a little. But that's a problem, right? If we have a huge number of people who feel that they were promised elite positions and they suddenly become downwardly mobile, they're actually not going to go into the real world and get a real job. No, they'll join an activist organization. They'll run for mayor of New York.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and then, maybe the bodegas get nationalized.
Yeah, exactly. Oh my God. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. Tyler Winklevoss said this tweet where he was like, "Hey, I was thinking of getting involved in the race and trying to prevent him from winning, but maybe a whole new generation who's kind of excited about these ideas, maybe they need to learn the hard way the impacts of those ideas." I wonder if that in fact will happen.
I wonder as well. But, I'm going to note that if the bodegas do get nationalized, I believe that every single one of the workers will keep their position. And it will, in fact, not be replaced by a humanoid robot when the time comes. So there's a real way in which automation can push for a political economy where the conservation of a large amount of jobs at the same time becomes such an overriding priority that we just take it out of the market, right? We move it from the world of supply and demand to the world of bureaucracy. And we move it from the world of kind of mission oriented bureaucracy to self-protecting bureaucracy. So it's actually, let's say the economic impact of the white collar work, I think, is positive. At the end of the day, the introduction of the spreadsheet and the introduction of email was certainly productive and made running organizations easier in the 1980s. People forget now that, what was it, Lotus 123 or the predecessors to Excel were actually a big deal in the paper pushing world. Can you imagine doing that on paper by hand, keeping the books that way, cracking numbers that way? That was a totally different mode of work. So I think that modest economic impact will happen due to the use of tools like ChatGPT and so on. And then the question is, how good is it, right? If it's automating half of the white collar work, then I think it's good for economic growth. If it's automating 90% of white collar work, you know what? If it's also automating 90% of physical work, then we're still growing very fast. But if we're in the danger zone where AI is only automating 95% of white collar work, and it's not automating the truck drivers, the farmers, the firemen's, the physical part of the fireman's job, right? The fireman's already, being a firefighter is already kind of a desk job in some ways. You could imagine it being fully a desk job where you're just like overseeing this like humanoid robot that goes heroically run into the building and, rescues the family from the fire. Certainly specialized rescue robots will eventually do it better than any human can, no matter how handsome or strong the human is. But I think if we are in that danger zone politically, it could be disastrous. Here's one. AI that only automates knowledge work will probably cause negative economic growth because the political reaction will be so harsh. So in other words, maybe a Marxist has this theory of like, the workers, the proletariat rises up. I'm more scared of the email jobs. Like I'm scared of the laptop class. Okay. The laptop class can Karen their way to a fully, state-owned economy if they wanted to. They can tweet, they can write emails, they can organize, they can write policy papers. And, actually that's pretty scary.
Yeah. Whereas the physical class, they don't have as many tools as they're at their disposal.
Right. Like they might have like a riot or something, but it's not even because offshoring is an option. It's not like workers have more leverage than the underclass. Like the riot is something that you can do without having a job, right? And politically, the welfare recipients are the more reliable voters anyway, compared to the employed ones. So I don't know. I am optimistic about the extension of physical labor because look, currently, let's say Tesla is like gloriously and beautifully disruptive. And within 5 years, just everyone's just used to having a robo taxi and they're operated by local firms. Like there's like, maybe there's a Tesla maintenance company here in San Francisco and they have 70% of the market and there's 20% is Waymo, or you flip those two numbers around. Those robots will still not be making those beautiful fences, those beautiful stonework fences. And those robots will not immediately be tending to the vineyards that are making, Californian wine. And those robots will not immediately be replacing chefs or yoga instructors or personal trainers, right? Each of those will be a pretty dedicated company. Humanoid robotics, if it truly works in this general way that some companies are planning, that might be a different story. But for now, it seems to me that self-driving shows that if you want to apply AI to the physical world, you have to do something like a 5-year data gathering and prototyping effort to gather the physical data for that specific family of tasks. And, to get the sort of, let's put it this way, to get the like, currently it seems to me that once you solve just the problems of moving through space, to get the humanoid waiter would probably be a kind of specialized company. And maybe they first make their own hardware and then later on they buy an Optimus robot from Elon and they rig it with sensors, right? The same way that Waymo didn't make their own car. They just bought, cars from Jaguar and mounted extra sensors on them and did a lot of prototype testing and so on. And maybe you have to roll out the Optimus plus whatever this company is. I don't know. We could call it. Well, okay, Eric. You hear a lot of company names. Would you call a company that just promised to automate? Okay, Barista. There, I'm naming it Barista. Maybe it has 2 A's, and you just have locations called barista bars that have a liquor serving license where it's a dude's job to just sit and look at the robot checking the IDs at the door, and look at the robot that is serving people actually drinks, and they are there to have the liquor license that is demanded by the state of California or the city or whatever, right? And then in those very controlled environments, you learn actually the robots sometimes trip over people. People ignored the robots when the robots asked them to behave. Turns out you need a human bouncer for them to take the bouncer seriously. But humans, they love tipping the waiter, even though it doesn't make any sense. So if they see 20% tip, they're still going to tip your robot as if it's a person, et cetera, et cetera. You work out these things, and then maybe 4 or 5 years down the line, after running these test locations, you start selling them to bars. And then occasionally bartenders and restaurant owners decide to roll out with the barista bot or whatever, right? And like run with it. And I think if you have 50 or 60 companies like this, I think that's rapid. That's actually more than 1% a year extra economic growth. That could be 2 or 3% a year extra economic growth. And because it is basically just upskilling in a way workers, and because it is moving workers from one task to another, and there's so many different physical, low skill, high skill manual tasks, people at all levels of the intellectual and other personality trait bell curves can find new niches. And actually, the cost of labor keeps going up, and that becomes very good and becomes a virtuous cycle where the high labor costs in a new domain eventually hit the tipping point where you want to invest in a specialized automation company. So I guess what I'm saying is, I'm hoping from an economic and social and political perspective that the full-on Optimus bot vision actually doesn't work. So that you don't build the truly general embodied intelligence. That it actually takes a lot of work to get all of these, mechanical, kinetic, soft social skills exactly right for each profession. In that world, I think we have solid economic growth, and we have a generally felt sense of optimism, maybe even an expanded middle class. And in the world just of Optimus, we have economic growth, but we'll have a rapidly growing welfare class, which is fine. But if with the growth of the welfare class, you also have a growth of the paper pushers wanting to secure their own jobs that are somewhat automated, then you could have a really dysfunctional economy, a really dysfunctional situation.
I have one maybe last question and ask. It's a bit of a potentially Thorian one, but some people are sort of questioning sort of this, Meta, for example, the new hires that they made, there are a lot of immigrants, and particularly a lot of Chinese immigrants, and sort of this broader conversation about immigration that we're having, but also just around like the upper level of talent. Some people joke of like, our Indian CEOs will beat their Indian CEOs, or our Chinese researchers will beat their Chinese researchers. Like, how should we think about this, if we should even think about this at all?
Well, first off, China doesn't have any Indian CEOs, right? So I think top talent is like definitely desirable. And I think one is hard pressed to find the argument that you shouldn't have certain skill based immigration. But again, I think the truth is that it's all a matter of potential and margin. Like I said, I already said earlier, and I think I stand by it, and it's as true of China as it is of Germany or the United Kingdom or the United States, or it would be true of Russia. If they could poach world-class talent, I think that for certain industries, you actually want to have, like, I don't know, a third or half of the CEOs be citizens who have been born in the country rather than people who immigrated later in life. And, I'm saying this is, someone who's an immigrant. It just feels very unstable. You ideally want, America has like ambition and the profit motive going for it. And that's enough to do a lot, but it's never enough to motivate someone to seek alternatives to something like offshoring. Offshoring is economically always the best idea. And I think the sort of unstated thing is that people patriotically want to develop the United States in particular, or the Western world in particular. And people who are from China also sometimes want to develop China for those reasons. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. And certainly no reason to not just always pick the best person for the best job. But at a policy level, I think one should tweak it so as to keep about half of a crucial industry filled with workers from your country. And this is almost doesn't matter if the country I'm discussing is Italy, or if it's Israel, or if it's the US, or if it's China or Japan. I think this question will only come up in countries like the United States, Australia, or Canada that have a long history and tradition of immigration. Let me give one more argument. If you have a homogenous culture in your company, and there are entire departments that speak only Hindi or speak only Mandarin or speak only Russian, that's actually not fair to all the other immigrants, right? They came to the US, they presumably speak, they're trying to learn English, they're trying to fit into this context. Under the appearance of general meritocracy, you might just replace one form of protectionism with another, even if it's a very soft, very implicit one, right? And I think that assimilation works best when you have a great diversity of people coming in. It's better to receive 20 million, high-performing immigrants from like 20 different countries than it is to receive them from one country.
Yeah, I think this is a good place to wrap. This has been a wide-ranging conversation on all things AI, automation, China. Samo, as always, until next time.
Until next time.
Thanks for listening to Live Players. Please subscribe, leave a review, and check out Samo's excellent newsletter, The Bismarck Brief, for more rigorous analysis of key individuals, institutions, or industries. Live Players is a production of Turpentine, the podcast network behind Econ 102 with Noah Smith and Moment of Zen.